I never thought a single sentence in the Bible could make me feel exposed. I had read scripture for years. I went to church almost every Sunday. I prayed before meals. I sang the worship songs. I knew the right answers when people asked questions about faith. But one morning, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, I read a verse I had seen dozens of times before. This time it felt different. It felt like God was talking directly to me. And what I realized that morning changed my life. The strange part is that the sin wasn't something people usually talk about. It wasn't one of the obvious things Christians often warn each other about. It was something quieter, something respectable, something many believers, including me, ignored every day. For most of my life, I considered myself a good Christian. I worked hard. I loved my family. I stayed out of trouble. At least that's what I told myself. I was in my early 60s then. My wife and I had been married for over 30 years. We had grown children and a few grandchildren who brought joy into our lives. From the outside, everything looked fine, but there was something nobody knew. I carried bitterness everywhere I went. I didn't call it bitterness. I called it being hurt. I called it being realistic. I called it remembering what people had done to me. But deep down, it was bitterness. And it had been growing for years. The person at the center of it all was my younger brother. We hadn't spoken in almost 12 years. Whenever someone asked about him, I would shrug and say, "That's a long story." Then I'd quickly change the subject. The truth was, I didn't want to tell the story because every time I did, the anger came back. 12 years earlier, after our father died, my brother and I had a terrible disagreement over the family property. I felt betrayed. I believed he had manipulated the situation and taken advantage of me during one of the hardest seasons of my life. The argument became ugly. Words were said that couldn't be taken back. The last thing I remember hearing him say was, "Maybe we're better off staying away from each other." And that's exactly what happened. At first I expected him to apologize. When he didn't, I waited. Then I waited longer. Eventually, years passed. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, silence. The strange thing was that I convinced myself I was the victim. I replayed the story so many times in my head that I became the hero and he became the villain. I never questioned my version of events. Then one Sunday, my pastor preached about forgiveness. I sat there with my arms crossed. I listened politely, but inside I was already arguing. "You don't understand what he did. You don't know the whole story. Some things are unforgivable." I left church feeling irritated, not convicted, not changed, just irritated. A few days later, I opened my Bible and landed on a verse from Ephesians. It talked about getting rid of bitterness, rage, anger, and malice. Then it said to forgive one another just as God forgave us. I stared at those words. Forgive one another. I remember saying out loud, "Lord, that's easy for you to say." The moment the words left my mouth, I felt ashamed. I sat quietly for a long time. Then another thought entered my mind. What if my biggest problem isn't what my brother did? What if my biggest problem is what I've become because of it? That question followed me everywhere. While driving, while eating dinner, while lying awake at night. I couldn't escape it. A few weeks later, something happened that made everything worse. Or at least I thought it did. My daughter called me one evening. Her voice sounded nervous. She said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I immediately assumed something was wrong. Then she told me she had been speaking to my brother. My stomach tightened. "What?" I asked. She hesitated. "He reached out a few months ago." I felt betrayed. For a moment, I was angry at both of them. I couldn't believe she had hidden it from me. Then she said something that completely caught me off guard. "He asks about you all the time." I didn't know what to say. That wasn't supposed to happen. In my version of the story, he didn't care. In my version, he had moved on years ago. But now I was hearing something different. My daughter continued, "He talks about you with tears in his eyes, Dad." I sat in silence. That sentence bothered me more than I wanted to admit. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling. What if I didn't know the whole story? What if I had spent years building a wall around something I never fully understood? Still, I wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. Then came the twist I never expected. A few months later, I received a phone call from an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't answer. For some reason, I did. A woman's voice introduced herself. She was my brother's neighbor. Immediately, my heart started racing. She explained that my brother had been taken to the hospital. He had collapsed unexpectedly. I felt like the air had left the room. I asked if he was okay. There was a pause. Then she said, "The doctors aren't sure." I hung up and sat there frozen. For 12 years, I had imagined a lot of things. I imagined winning arguments. I imagined proving I was right. I imagined hearing an apology. I never imagined getting a phone call that might be my last chance. For 2 days, I did nothing. I paced around the house. I prayed. I argued with myself. Part of me wanted to go. Part of me wanted to stay home. The bitterness that had lived inside me for so long wasn't ready to leave quietly. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror. I looked older than I remembered, tired, worn down, and I asked myself a question I couldn't ignore. If he dies tomorrow, can I live with this? The answer terrified me. No, I couldn't. The next morning I got in my car. The drive felt longer than it really was. Every mile brought back memories. Some were good, some were painful. I remembered us fishing as kids. I remembered riding bikes together. I remembered laughing so hard our stomachs hurt. I also remembered the arguments, the anger, the hurt. By the time I arrived at the hospital, my hands were shaking. I almost turned around. Then I walked inside. When I entered his room, I barely recognized him. He looked smaller, older, fragile. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his eyes filled with tears. Mine did too. And suddenly 12 years felt very small. I walked closer. He looked at me and whispered, "You came." That's all he said. You came. I thought about all the speeches I had prepared over the years, all the things I wanted to say, all the ways I planned to explain why I was right. None of them mattered anymore. I pulled up a chair beside his bed. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "I've missed you." The words broke something inside me. I started crying. Not polite tears, real tears. The kind that come from somewhere deep. Then he said something I never expected. "I'm sorry." I looked at him. He shook his head. I should have handled things differently. For years, I thought hearing those words would make me feel victorious. Instead, they made me feel sad. Because I realized how much time we had lost. I took a deep breath. Then I told him something he probably never expected to hear. "I'm sorry too." He looked surprised. So was I. But the words kept coming. I apologized for my pride, my anger, my stubbornness, my refusal to reach out, my decision to let a wound become my identity. For over an hour we talked, really talked. For the first time in years, we listened instead of defending ourselves. And slowly, pieces of the story I never knew started to emerge. I learned things about that old family dispute that completely changed my perspective. Not because he was innocent, not because I was innocent, but because the truth was far more complicated than either of us had admitted. We had both made mistakes. We had both been hurt. We had both allowed pride to lead us. As I sat there listening, another realization hit me. The sin God had been trying to show me wasn't just bitterness. It was unforgiveness. And unforgiveness had stolen more from me than my brother ever did. It stole years of peace, years of family memories, years of relationships, years of joy. The person suffering most from my unforgiveness wasn't him. It was me. That truth was hard to accept. A few days later, my brother was released from the hospital. Thankfully, his condition wasn't as serious as doctors first feared. But something serious had happened. Not in his body, in my heart. For the first time in over a decade, I felt free. Not because everything was fixed overnight. Not because every wound disappeared. But because I stopped carrying something God never intended me to carry. Over the following months, my brother and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. It wasn't instant. Trust takes time. Healing takes time. But we kept showing up. Phone calls became regular. Family dinners returned. Birthdays felt different. The grandchildren finally got to know their uncle again. One evening, we sat together on a porch watching the sun go down. We talked about getting older, about regrets, about the years we couldn't get back. Then my brother said something I'll never forget. He looked at me and smiled. We wasted a lot of time, didn't we? I laughed softly. Yeah, we did. Then he added, let's not waste what's left. I think about that conversation often, because the truth is many of us assume we have more time to forgive, more time to apologize, more time to make things right. But none of us are promised tomorrow. I learned that lesson in a hospital room, and it changed the way I look at life. Since then, I've spoken with many people who carry similar burdens. Some haven't spoken to a sibling in years. Some are angry at a former friend. Some are holding on to wounds caused by a parent, a child, or a spouse. And I understand. I really do. Forgiveness isn't easy. Some hurts run deep. Some scars last a lifetime. But I've learned something important. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. It doesn't mean calling evil good. It doesn't mean allowing people to keep hurting you. Sometimes boundaries are necessary. Sometimes wisdom is necessary. But forgiveness means refusing to let bitterness become your master. It means releasing the right to keep collecting emotional debt from someone who may never pay it back. And that's hard, very hard. I still have moments when old memories try to return. I still remember painful conversations. I still remember tears. But now, when those memories come, they no longer own me, because I've experienced what happens when God's way is better than my way. The greatest surprise wasn't that my brother and I reconciled. The greatest surprise was how much God changed me in the process. For years, I thought God wanted me to fix my brother. Instead, he wanted to heal my heart. For years, I thought the problem was someone else's sin. Instead, God showed me my own. That was a painful lesson, but it was also one of the most beautiful lessons of my life. Today, when I sit at my kitchen table with my Bible open, I often think back to that morning when a familiar verse suddenly felt personal. At the time, I didn't know it would start a journey that would change everything. I didn't know it would lead me to a hospital room. I didn't know it would restore a broken relationship. I didn't know it would expose a hidden sin I had been carrying for years. But God knew, and I'm grateful He didn't leave me where I was. If you're listening to my story and there's someone you haven't spoken to in years, I can't tell you exactly what to do. Every situation is different. Every wound is different. But I can encourage you to be honest with God. Ask Him to show you what's really in your heart. That's where my healing started. Not when my brother apologized. Not when circumstances changed. But when I stopped pretending everything was fine. The older I get, the more I realize life moves quickly. One moment you're young and convinced you have endless tomorrows. The next moment you're looking back wondering where the years went. I don't want to spend whatever time I have left carrying bitterness. I don't want to stand before God someday knowing I ignored what He clearly asked me to do. And I don't want anyone else to make the mistake I made, because the sin I ignored for years looked harmless. It looked justified. It even looked reasonable. But it quietly stole pieces of my life until I finally surrendered it to God. Today, my brother and I still talk regularly. Sometimes we laugh about old memories. Sometimes we talk about our grandchildren. Sometimes we simply enjoy the gift of having another conversation we once thought would never happen. And every time I hear his voice, I'm reminded of something important. Being right is overrated. Peace is priceless. If there's one lesson my story taught me, it's this. The sins that damage us most aren't always the loud ones everyone notices. Sometimes they're the quiet ones we defend, excuse, and carry for years. And when God puts His finger on one of those hidden places in our hearts, the safest thing we can do is listen, because freedom often begins where pride finally ends.